The time is just gone, 13 minutes past 8 p.m. on the Alternative Voice this evening. I am Inayat Wadi, and we are coming to you live on facebook.com/Salam Media and also on all the other platforms of Salam Media. We are now shifting focus. The discussion is going to be based mainly on post COVID 19 and talking about a new world order on the horizon. Now, we've already seen a world that is looking very, very different in the times that we are in, and with the pandemic that is so rife across the entire world. The key questions here is, what are the changes that we are likely to see post COVID 19? Are we likely to see changes on a social level, on a socio-economic level, on a political level? And looking at society in general, human relations in terms of how we interact with each other, because we know that many of the regulations surrounding COVID 19, we talk about social distancing and the like, things have changed. And the key question is, will they change forever? Are we looking at a new world? Are we looking at a different world? And this evening, we joined on the line by Dr. Palani Mtembu with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Dr. Palani, good evening to you, sir, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yes, now, obviously, we've seen what COVID-19 has done, what it has resulted in, Dr. Palani, and we see many studies already being conducted on what the new world order would be looking like, what would be on the horizon. And the questions here that have been asked is, will globalization survive as a result of COVID-19? And just your take, just your reading in the situation in terms of, are we likely to see a very, very different world from what we are living in at this point in time?
Well, I think we are seeing a different world evolving. But some of the changes that we're witnessing are changes that were taking place already prior to COVID-19. It seems that some of these changes have been accelerated by the global pandemic. So you mentioned, for instance, a crisis in globalization. Some are saying, have we reached essentially the peak when it comes to a globalized world order? Are we going to see an increasingly fragmented world order? And there's a number of trends that we are seeing. Obviously, key to watching this evolving order is the relationship between the two most powerful economies in the world, two most powerful countries in the world, China and the United States. And the manner in which this relationship evolves is going to be important. But I think also there's a number of key players that are also going to be important. For instance, the European Union will have to increasingly step up and accelerate some of the discussions that they have been having about the EU being a more autonomous actor in the world, especially if you want to see a world order that doesn't fragment along the lines of the US on the one side and maybe China on the other. I think the pandemic highlights the importance of global cooperation, but it hits us at a time where global cooperation is at a low period, and it therefore heightens, I think, this importance. So we don't want to see a completely fragmenting world order. I mean, in order to tackle this pandemic, we need all these countries, firstly, to be working together, to be cooperating, to first try to solve and to overcome COVID-19, and then, to actually chart a new course, because I don't think we will be returning to the old normal. I mean, the old normal was already not working for a majority of the people in the world. So I think it's important to reflect on some of the challenges we witnessed already prior to COVID-19, which have been accentuated and brought to the surface by the pandemic, such as inequality, such as poverty, such as job security. And all these discussions, quality education, these are the discussions which were important prior to COVID-19, but they have actually had to be accelerated as a result of COVID-19.
Yes, in fact, Dr. Pilani, what you're saying is very true because what COVID-19 has done is it's exposed badly the failure of capitalism and all the inequalities that we speak about. And we know that with all this talk, with all this push for democracies right around the entire world, we've seen it in the past with the Arab Spring as well, the push for democracies, but we haven't seen true democracy. And this is a result why we see all these failures of capitalism and how it has impacted on a people who actually believed and they firmly believed that capitalism was working for them.
Yes, I mean, I think I mean, you mentioned inequality, and inequality is something that is growing not just in the developing world, but it's something that's also growing in developed countries. So when we talk about global inequality, it's important to note that this is not something that's just unique to the global south. I mean, you look at a society like the United States, you look at what's happening domestically within the US. People calling for essentially a new social contract, a new relationship between citizens and the state and security services. And you go to Europe, people also demanding changes within their societies. And I think it's quite clear that the pre-COVID-19 world order actually it created the conditions for COVID-19 to have the type of impact that it is having. Because I mean, even if you look at the pandemic itself, so the Institute for Global Dialogue has been working on a new series which is called Zoonotica, and this basically sketches a post-pandemic world order. And essentially, what we're seeing is that what you were mentioning, this crisis in capitalism, which actually created some of the conditions for COVID-19 to actually thrive, but to also arise, because we've been creeping closer and closer into the environment. When we talk about the post-COVID world order, it's important to understand that we're not only talking about an order in terms of relations amongst human societies, but it's also about how human societies relate with nature. And we know that the pre-COVID-19 global order created a number of ecological things which actually need to be resolved in a post-COVID-19 world order. Because whilst there is a health crisis that we're seeing in many countries, that health crisis will be followed by an economic crisis, which we are already seeing. And that economic crisis is going to be followed by an even greater ecological crisis. And these are some of the challenges which were actually where the conditions that were created prior to COVID-19 actually assisted in the world arriving to where it is.
Yes, but also we know that there are some who actually hold the view that what COVID-19 or this pandemic has done is it's allowed us to press the reset button. Okay. And I just want to talk a bit about that reset button and in which direction are we likely to go once we've pressed this reset button? Because with the pandemic and in managing or controlling the pandemic, we've seen a world that has gone a lot more draconian. And this appears to be a big fear on the part of the masses, that are we likely to continue under these draconian regulations and laws?
I think in some countries, certainly, I mean, some countries for instance, went into these various states of emergency. But some countries went into these without actually even saying when such measures would actually end. So, I mean, we've seen in previous crises in the world where certain measures are taken, by governments, that some of those measures long outlive the crises in which they were responding to. So, whether we're talking about privacy and technology, whether we're talking about obviously things such as social distancing, those things will remain with us, for the foreseeable future. But I think there are also other concerns in certain countries, at least without proper checks and balances, where certain branches of the state may use the crisis to actually increase their level of authority at the expense of the rest of society. And I think this is something that we will have to obviously keep a close eye on, but to also try to prevent from happening by ensuring that there are various checks and balances, whether it is the different branches of government, but also through civil society and also through international relations. I think it's important that the global community ensures that the new norm does not necessarily infringe indefinitely on the rights of citizens. So it's important to be very clear when regulations are actually made, how long those regulations would actually last, how are you actually monitoring those particular regulations, and ensuring that there's a consultative process throughout this period. And that's going to be quite important, I think.
Exactly. Well, what we're going to do, Dr. Palani, right now is we're going to go for a quick break. We're going to pay a few bills, and we'll be back with you shortly.
Sure.
The time is just gone, 27 minutes past 8 p.m. on the Alternative Voice on Salam Media. Still coming to you live on facebook.com/Salam Media. We have got Dr. Palani Mthembu, and he's with the Institute for Global Dialogue. And we are talking about post-COVID-19 and the new world order. Dr. Palani, just to continue from where we left off, and we know in the short term, we are expecting to see post-COVID-19 a world that is possibly less open, will be less prosperous, and possibly even less free. And that is in the short term. But the key issue here is when one looks at the powers that be, when one looks at the governments of the day, it is going to be very, very difficult for them to relinquish any power whatsoever. And this is the reason why we've seen emergency measures to manage the crisis, but some of them considered to be a lot more draconian. But looking at it from a global perspective, and let's talk about global power, because we've got two issues here. Either the global powers embark on a path of greater collaboration with each other, or they could also embark on a path of division. And I think this is where the critical question lies, and also in terms of who is going to come out on top. And we know at this point in time, we know what is the situation with the United States of America, and we've got China that has got its ambitions as well.
No, I think this is going to be the most important relationship, and it's going to affect everyone. I mean, it's going to affect the level of cooperation that we're going to be seeing. I mean, what we essentially seeing is an increasingly confrontational relationship between the United States and China, and that doesn't bode well for international cooperation as a whole, because essentially, with a growth of unilateralism that we're seeing from the US, it's, whether it comes to climate change, whether it comes to its level of support for the World Health Organization, we've seen it with growing support from the World Health Organization. We've seen it blaming China for COVID-19 and for the spread of COVID-19. But I also think an important area we're going to be watching closely is the area of technological advancement. The US is increasingly becoming confrontational on the ascent of China in the tech space. In fact, much of these trade wars that preceded COVID-19 were primarily rooted in China's growth as a technological power. And if you look at China's own internal plans, I mean, they're planning to be a serious player in terms of high-tech manufacturing by 2025. And I think what's going to be important is how the US navigates this relationship with China. We don't, we've seen in the past when you have an emerging power and a status quo power, that it has not always been, it has not always resulted in positive gains, for the world. So increasingly, if the US is becoming more insular, if it's looking to dismantle existing systems of cooperation, it's going to become increasingly problematic. But what we also need to look at is not only, let's say, the international dynamics of this relationship between the US and China, but also the internal contradictions of these particular countries, and whether their internal politics allow them to actually cooperate, to build bridges. I mean, certainly if the current President Trump, if he is re-elected in November, then I think we will just see an escalation of the type of frictions that we already seeing. But I think even if his competitor, Joe Biden, even if he were to win the presidency, recent polls are showing that the US public is increasingly skeptical of China, and therefore, even if a Biden were to win, he would preside over a country that is increasingly seeing China as a threat. I mean, the 2017 National Security Strategy of the US specifically points to China as a strategic threat. And if that is the nature of the relationship, it makes global cooperation that much harder. The World Trade Organization, we're already seeing challenges there, especially around the dispute resolution mechanism. And unless, the great powers are able to overcome the differences and to encourage cooperation, it will not bode well for global cooperation as a whole, but it won't bode well also for the immediate or the near term when it comes to a post COVID-19 order. I do still think you will have still a lot of countries who do have an interest in international cooperation, but their level of cooperation will be hindered by the type of relationship that evolves between the US and China.
Yes, and I think also what is important to understand is historically, we've seen plagues in the past, and they did not end any power rivalry that existed even at that point in time. So, to talk about global cooperation, obviously, possibly to an extent, but this is a conflict of nature of world politics, Dr.
Mm,
Pilani. And we are going to see those conflicts continue all the time. But the key question here would be, with regards to who has got the greatest power, who has got the greater influence. Because when we
mm,
talk about world powers, history teaches us that you can't have more than two or three world powers at any given point in time.
mm. I think what we seeing an acceleration of is this contestation. I mean, we've had it for some time now, that this contestation of U.S. hegemony, and essentially a superpower does not voluntarily give up, the power that it's amassed over time. I mean, you look throughout the world, and the U.S. has hundreds of military bases scattered, throughout the world. It has a huge global presence. So when it comes to the military side, the U.S. remains currently this, a superpower. But when it comes to other areas, whether it's in the economy, whether it's on other social indicators, the U.S. is increasingly challenged, and the Chinese economy will surpass the U.S. economy at a certain period of time, and what that will also mean is that China will be able to also dedicate more material resources to other areas, such as the military, but also in terms of research and technology development. And I think also what's important to keep in mind is that as technology changes and as this competition over technology intensifies, it means that China may not need to have the size or the expansive presence, physical presence of military bases like the US has, because it may rely on newer sources of technology to actually enhance its military capabilities. And that's something to actually keep an eye on. But also, on the other hand, is that if the US economy does not fare well in the medium term, then they will increasingly be under strain to actually pull back from its global military positionings. So a lot is also going to be relying on what happens, domestically. You look at a country like China; they championing the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Belt and Road Initiative is currently, I mean, the most ambitious plan that is out there, when it comes to the great powers. I mean, it's essentially incorporating vast parts of the world, and looking to essentially also reshape the global trade and cooperation landscape. So we will still have global cooperation, and of course, it's. But I think what's going to happen in the immediate term, at least, is that you will have a fragmenting of this global cooperation. Some countries will feel under immense pressure and will be pressurized by the US to actually pull closer to them, not use certain technology from China, such as Huawei, the battle over 5G. And some countries will feel that they are caught up in this. They'll feel that if they enter into agreements with China, they'll be put under pressure by the United States. And that's going to complicate the immediate term, the immediate to medium term when it comes to global cooperation.
Well, interesting that you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, because just before you came on air, we were talking about this standoff between China and India on the border. And one of the issues that came out quite strongly in the discussion was the Belt and Road Initiative, and America obviously using countries or states like India sympathetic to its cause to have a go at China. And this is part and parcel of America, and we always hear about the American dream. We hear about America First policy. But domestically, and you pointed out correctly, what sort of impact this is likely to have for America domestically, and with the recent developments that have taken place in America with the killing or the murder of George Floyd. Things have actually changed very, very fast for the United States of America, and they need to do some serious introspection as to where they are at this point in time.
Absolutely. I think the manner in which they handle what's happening domestically is going to be very important in terms of how they emerge, from this current pandemic, because already the pandemic was showing the inequality within the U.S. society. I mean, a disproportionate amount of African Americans were the ones who were actually succumbing to COVID-19. And that spoke largely to the inequality when it comes to healthcare within the society. And I think with what's now happening, where the US is increasingly under the world spotlight, is having to confront its internal contradictions and its inequalities. It's absolutely going to be vital in terms of the type of role that the US actually plays, because if the US isn't able to bridge bridges or to build bridges domestically, and to actually take care of some of its internal challenges and its inequality, some of its years and years of systematic racism. If it's not able to handle that, then it will be weakened domestically, because then what will happen is that it will become a much more polarized society. And a polarized society domestically will impact the type of role that the US is actually able to play in international relations. And certainly there will be countries that will be looking at the developments domestically in the US, and whether explicitly or directly or indirectly, they will obviously also be looking what kind of impact that will have on the US's geopolitical role, and if it's hampered by domestic politics, then that will actually accelerate this transition of the US moving, or at least of the world order moving from a unipolar world order to a multipolar world order.
Yes, and I think also what is important to understand is when one looks at all the other countries around the world, and many countries as they get out of this pandemic and looking at post COVID-19, is they are going to within to try and strengthen their own capacities to deal
Mm,
with the impact and the effects of COVID-19, and we're talking about possibly even economic self-isolation. So I think these
mm,
are some very, very critical, some very important factors that one needs to take into account. Where previously America, the United States of America, at the drop of the hat, could garner support from the rest of the
mm.
world. And this is something in a post COVID-19 environment may change because each country has got their own problems. So that would mean that the US may not be as influential as it has been in the build up to this COVID-19 crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, I think already what we are seeing, well, firstly from the US itself has become much more, adopted a stance of economic nationalism. And what COVID-19 has actually done is it's also exposed the weaknesses in the global supply chains. Now, the US is going to try to reverse some of those things. It's going to try to attract some of its companies, to actually manufacture their products closer to the US rather than to manufacture in China. Or they're going to look for uh, other countries such as India, such as Vietnam, and others, where they would actually move manufacturing to. And I think what's happening also is that, as you mentioned, that countries are going to look at their vulnerabilities and try to build up their own capacities. Now, we're seeing on the African continent, for instance, is that we've realized through COVID-19, of course, we knew it before, but we've realized just how vulnerable the continent can be when it comes to global supply chains. I mean, you look at the challenges of sourcing important medical equipment, of sourcing test kits, and so forth. If we do not have our own regional supply chains, it renders the continent much more vulnerable in the global economy. So various regions are going to have to, try to address some of these vulnerabilities. And in Africa, that might be through, for instance, the creation or supporting the creation of regional value chains, so that you're actually trying to attract manufacturing within the continent rather than the continent only shipping raw materials. And of course, Africa is seized with the whole idea of the African Continental Free Trade Area and operationalizing this Continental Free Trade Area. So, in a way, Africa is bucking the trend of isolation because the continent is trying to actually cooperate more. What we realize is that as a continent, we're not cooperating enough. So, if we are to be more resilient within the global economy, we need to trade more with each other. We need to have complementarities when it comes to the type of goods that we're producing and the type of markets that we're actually seeing or seeking. And I think as countries turn not only within their own nation states, but also as they turn increasingly within their own regions, you will find that it will not just, influence for the US will not come as easily as it came before. There's a lot of credibility issues that the US will have to deal with, both internally, but also when it comes to its international relations. And this is not just with its relations with with developing countries, but this includes with its traditional allies. I mean, it's transatlantic partnerships. have increasingly come under strain. And this has been a direct result of this America First attitude. And so influence will not come as easily to the United States as it actually came before COVID 19.
Yes, and just talking about Africa and what is important to understand from an African perspective is we know there has been a scramble for Africa by all the major players right across the entire world getting into Africa. And this is post COVID 19, where Africa needs to seize this initiative and looking at it from a perspective where not looking at just investments from a handout perspective, but in terms of building a relationship where Africa is given an opportunity to build its own capacity.
Absolutely. I mean, before COVID 19, for the last 15 or 15 to 20 years, consistently, the fastest growing economies in the world, at least six or seven, have been African economies. So, it hits the continent at a time where it was growing rapidly. And in that sense, I think the continent will be trying to minimize the impact, but also the continent will be trying to assert itself more in international relations. And we are seeing increasing efforts between the regional economic communities and the African Union to coordinate better, to actually come up with continental positions. We do have, Agenda 2063, which lays out where the continent wants to go. But more so, we've also got these 10-year implementation plans that have been agreed to by members of the African Union. And I think what's going to be challenging and what's going to be important for the continent is its ability to use international relations to actually advance the development interests of the continent, so that we are not just peripheral players when it comes to international relations, but that we are actually asserting our strength as individual countries, but importantly as a collective. And we've seen efforts to move in this direction when it comes to responding to COVID 19. There's mechanisms that have been put in place on the continent to actually source important medical equipment, not as individual countries, but to source it collectively in order to reduce costs, but also to have a greater bargaining power and a greater purchasing power when it comes to securing this vital equipment. So such trends are going to have to continue into the post-COVID 19 world order if the continent is to continue to assert itself and to actually continue to try to increase its agency in global politics.
Yes. Now, just looking at China's position now, obviously China has been ahead of the pack, first into the COVID 19 pandemic, first out of the pandemic as well. And China, life back to normal, and being ahead of the pack, does that give China an advantage over the rest?
Well, it does give it a slight advantage, but I think also the nature of this pandemic is that you cannot let your guard down. We saw just recently another outbreak in parts of Beijing, and immediately the state reacted very quickly, locked down communities that were affected. But I do think that for China to continue to thrive, it also needs other countries to safely move or to safely navigate, because there's no use for China to be to get back to normal and start producing goods and services, but then to not be able to actually have markets to sell those particular services and goods to. So China needs the rest of the world to also recover. But I do think that it's been able to efficiently deal with the crisis domestically, and that's placed it at a position where it can now, as part of its international relations, engage with the rest of the world in terms of supplying medical equipment. There's going to be obviously a growing demand there. So China has yes come out with a certain advantage, but it needs the rest of the world to also recover in order for the Chinese economy to return to anything that resembles a pre-COVID-19 economic landscape.
Yes, Dr. Richard, Dr. Pilani, we've just joined by Rutendo Matinyarari, who is with Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War Sanctions. Good evening to you, Rutendo.
Good evening. How are you doing? And I'm sorry I'm late.
Yes, no, very well, thanks. But I'm still glad you're able to join us, and even though for a few minutes. Now, we have been talking about the new world order post COVID-19. We have had extensive discussions with regards to where we are at this point in time and what we are likely to see, what is going to happen once we get out of this pandemic and this crisis. Now, just from your perspective, and we are obviously seeing a lot of changes already in society. We're seeing changes in human behavior, in human relationships as well. We see a lot more draconian legislation that has come to the fore. And just in your analysis and what we're seeing right now and what we are likely to see once we get out of this pandemic.
Yes, we're living in quite a scary time because, like you're saying, it's becoming 1984 Orwellian type of society. And we see the arrest of people for making comments that the establishment considers as fake news. Yet we've always lived with fake news, a lot of misinformation by the mainstream media. So anything that's coming away from the mainstream media is now being considered as fake news. We're also realizing that people are becoming redundant. There is this threat that if human beings can be affected by a disease to the extent that the world and production has to be locked down, maybe we need an alternative to human beings, which starts to take us into the Internet of Things, AI, 4IR. A lot of people think it's going to be beneficial. I actually see it as a disadvantage because people are going to lose their jobs. They're going to be seen as vulnerable, and that is going to bring in machines, it's going to bring in computers. This whole working from home is going to make companies seek solutions of how it is that they can have a more productive investment from capital and machines so that they don't have to rely on human beings that are at home and unproductive. So we are living in a very scary time. And I remember a gentleman who created the very first quantum computer. His name is Gordy Rose. And Gordy Rose was very clear. He says that in 2018, he actually made a presentation where he was saying, if only humanity knew what was coming in the next 5 to 10 years, they would be afraid of that because it's going to be bigger than the world wars. It's going to be bigger than any other event in human history. In fact, what's coming is going to be a tsunami. And what he was talking about is how quantum computers are going to bring into effect basically machines to take over every single job that human beings are doing. And he was doing this with a company called D-Wave. He made the first 2 quantum computers that were sold to Google, and another one is with NASA. And after that, he created a new company in which now he was saying their objective is to utilize that quantum computing power to now bring into existence machines, computers, and algorithms that are going to take over almost every single job on Earth in the next 5 years from 2020 to 2025. So I don't think humanity is ready for what's coming. And I don't think we're getting enough information about what is coming. And what is coming is not good. What is coming is not beneficial for humanity. And what is coming is going to be a total transformation of life as we know it today.
Also, Rutendo, I'd just like to hear from you in terms of your thoughts on the global leadership in terms of managing this pandemic at this point in time, but also in terms of looking at it on a post-COVID-19 era. And with the current crop of leadership that we see around the entire world, do they have the ability to deal with the situation? Because at this point in time, I think most people, the masses right across the entire world, are fearful because they are venturing into unknown territory.
I don't think they've got control of what's happening right now, because right now we don't even have a full synopsis of what is this COVID-19. Is it really a disease? Does it really exist? Because there's so many conflicting reports from doctors in America, doctors in the United Kingdom. There are people that are shooting hospitals and taking videos of hospitals, giving an impression that what we're being told and what is really happening are two total separate things. So it makes me wonder if our leaders even have a clue what is really going on. Because if we, the public, still don't know what is really going on, if there's conspiracy theories that are going around, if there's suspicions that are going around coming from the establishment of the medical fraternity, it makes us wonder if our leaders even have a clue. And so when they've implemented strategies, we have to ask ourselves if they've implemented strategies that are fitting for the real problem, or they've implemented strategies for the Hegelian dialect that has been created and that we've been made to believe in. Otherwise, if they're not giving us a solution to the real problem, but they're giving us to this a solution to the problem that has been created to bring in a solution that is actually going to give us problems in future, that actually means that they don't have a clue and they haven't dealt with it. And so there's no leader that has dealt with it. And the question now we need to ask ourselves is, who is going to lead us into where we are supposed to go as humanity for our evolution, rather than who is leading us into the cage in which we're about to be put in.
Yes, I think that's an absolutely critical condition, and it's just such a pity that you joined us a bit late, Rutendo. But I want to hold you to a future program, because I think you've brought another dimension and further dynamics into some of the issues that we'd like to talk about. But unfortunately, time has obviously run out. But I'm hoping that you will oblige for a future program.
I will do. And I apologize for coming late today. So let's do another one. And then let's open up Pandora's box and see what we can come up with.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Palani, just final comments and just listening to what Rutendo had to say.
Oh, thank you very much, colleagues. I think we definitely need to do another dialogue on this, because I think what he's pointing is the state of humanity, and that we will not be in a good state, because there will be mass layoffs. There will be companies looking to go digital, and what does that say about the state, of human development? And I think this is something that we're going to have to guard very, 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 very closely, because if we don't, then, as he said, we might find ourselves that increasingly various jobs, actually being taken over by machinery. I mean, we've already been seeing it prior to COVID-19, but what the crisis has done is that it's actually accelerated some of those trends. So some of these major job losses, some of those jobs are not going to come back. Now, what new industries can we actually come up with so that people can retain employment in future, especially in Africa, where by 2050 the population would have doubled, to 2 billion, and we will need to have created industries rather than to have retrenched people.
Well, gentlemen, to both of you, really, as I said, you've opened up another angle that obviously we can have a wonderful discussion on. And just focusing a lot on Africa, we spoke about the state of humanity, human development in Africa post COVID-19. I think that's a topic that is just a subject on its own. And I'm hopeful that both of you, that we can engage with you on a future program, and not in the distant future. In fact, I'm hoping it's going to be pretty soon, while the issue is still fresh, and while we are discussing these matters. Hopefully we will get in touch with both of you quite soon to obviously further this to take this discussion further.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best to you guys. Cheers. Bye-bye. That was Dr. Palani Mtembu, Institute for Global Matinyarari. Zimbabweans unite against U.S. war sanctions. And it's clear that this has opened up another area of discussion. And these are issues that we need to talk about. I know we are so, we've become sort of obsessed with what is happening at this point in time. Lockdowns, lockdown level 3, level 2, when is going to happen, level 1. And then we are flooded with statistics right across the entire world in terms of new cases and new deaths and those things. But there are critical issues that will be facing us post COVID-19, and one of them is the state of humanity. What is the state of humanity going to be like? What is going to be the state of human development? And we're not talking about the immediate issue only. We're talking about future generations. We're talking about our children. We're talking about our grandchildren. And if this pandemic is going to have these devastating impact that it is having at this point in time, what is likely to happen as far as future generations are concerned? The time is just headed straight on to 9:05, and it's time for me to sign off. So for myself and the rest of the team here at Salam Media, it's been wonderful being in your company. So until we meet next week once again on the Alternative Voice, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.